distance of travel between homes and work have increased, and the speed of which travel has increased as well. So yeah, massive change in societal movement. David Harvey's discussed time-space compression, so that's speeding up and spreading out as precipitated by those technological developments in communications and changes in economic structure. And again, that little star at the bottom just kind of shows you really in very simple diagrammatic terms how that space, that different kind of 1 hour commute space has changed from, you know, walking cities, if you like, of old through to automobile linked freeways between CBDs and residential areas. So just thinking of the kind of classic suburban model. So the mobility dilemma we've got is the fact that we've built a society that depends very much on mobility, and particularly around the car or the automobile. And there's obviously benefits and disbenefits to that. The benefits, as we know, is increased range of choice. I've put that in hyphens here because obviously not choice for everybody in terms of where and how to live, work and spend leisure time, access to increased quantity of diversity of goods and services, you know, so you know you can travel to get your favorite yogurt from the supermarket the other side of town rather than the one close to your home. And for the most part, the improved standard of living. Again, huge caveats on that because it's not for everybody. The costs, environmental costs, of course, depletion of resources, emissions from greenhouse gases, both at a global level and local pollution, and the disruption of natural ecosystems. Social costs, traffic related killed and seriously injured, so traffic crashes and incidences, severance of communities, social exclusion, erosion of public space, particularly in urban areas, decreased livability, and then accompanying that, sedentary lifestyles, obesity and airborne related diseases. The economic cost tends to be kind of traditionally the focus, and that's productivity loss due to congestion on the roads and disproportionate investment in roads maintenance to keep the car system going. I think USA is a classic example of that, where it's got the oldest infrastructure in the world and a large proportion of finance and transport funds goes just simply maintaining that infrastructure before it crumbles and collapses. I guess in the UK, the kind of turning point, given that massive growth in motorisation from the 1920s and particularly in the 1950s, was the Canon Report. So 1963, Canon was charged in looking at traffic in towns and what could be done about it. How do we deal with the future growth in number of cars on our roads? So I've just put a few images there, really, a conceptual image of what our towns and cities might look like in the future, according to Buchanan. So very much separation of uses. Yeah, so I'm sure we can think of towns, cities like that. It's springing to mind straight away, Coventry. I'm a Midlander, so Coventry springs to mind when I see that image at the bottom. And Buchanan very much talks about how to mitigate the impact of the growth in vehicles, how to cater for it, how to supply the infrastructure for it, but also how to mitigate the impacts on local roads. So on the bottom left, you can see that kind of cellular network of primary distributors, district, local distributors, and then access roads. So very much the patterns we come to know today. So yeah, I mean, Buchanan very much laid out a kind of recipe, if you like, for dealing with traffic in towns, but very much put it as a value judgment on society. It's a choice that society's got to make in terms of how are we to live, how are we to arrange our towns and cities. I guess since the Traffic in Towns report that talked about kind of rationalising the system and incorporating a network of urban motorways and right down to distributor roads, enclosing our kind of neighboured streets or environmental areas, as Buchanan framed it. We've had, the politics of mobility, if you like, since then, about how we should deal with traffic. And I would argue the traditional strand has been and has reared its head again, I guess, in the last decade, is the idea that we need to expand car infrastructure, expand the highway network. The 90s was probably a moment when that did change. The break with that mentality changes. I'm thinking here of Planning Policy Guidance Note 13 that talked about how to arrange developments and reduce demand for car use. And of course, we had Prescott's 1998 Integrated Transport White Paper. As you can see here, I've just pulled out something by the non-quality press, lampooning Prescott's vision, as if we're going to kind of move into a Chinese communist model that we all should be riding bikes. So you can kind of get a sense of the political backdrop to which a more kind of integrated idea of transport and investment with a broader range of modes of travel was met by some sectors of the media and indeed society. So we find ourselves at the moment in this sort of triple crisis, if you like, of tackling the climate emergency, also promoting health and well-being, and supporting an ageing society. So transport has got obviously a role to play, has an impact on all of those three elements, and has a role to play in developing a kind of sustainable, more healthily and equitable or just mobility. That's the kind of context in which we work as spatial planners or people interested in spatial planning and transport. Bannister's paper back in 2008 really sets out this kind of paradigm, this new paradigm way of thinking in terms of sustainability, sustainable urban mobility, in his transport policy paper. So that really questions the underlying principles of conventional transport planning, i.e. predict and provide, and transport as a derived demand, and the impact that can have on terms of degradation of environments and disparities in health and environmental sustainability. Mobility paradigm, the ingredients, broadly speaking, of which is this idea of reducing the need to travel in the first place, and very much through using ICT. I think the example we're using at the moment, the delivery agent, is an example of that, reducing the need to travel. Number two, a modal shift from private cars towards walking, cycling and public transport. So very much conceived as those three as sustainable urban mobility. Implementation of land use policies that reduce distance to activities, so using spatial planning as a tool, mechanism. And then, of course, technological developments in vehicle design and efficiency. I think, Bannister's under no illusion that this is easy, and argues that this will require gaining public confidence and acceptability, which obviously in turn generates public political acceptability. So involvement is critical in bringing the public along and making them understand what this paradigm means and the benefits of it at a societal level. Of course, public health also has an interest in spatial planning and transport and the impact on society. And there's a general set consensus that the built environment design supportive of active mobility or walking and cycling could help to promote moderate physical activity, delay biological aging and age-related conditions, and improve overall health and well-being. So on a kind of societal health level and thinking of a kind of an aging society, there's many benefits here to implementing spatial planning that promotes sustainable transport. So there's lots of energy and effort going into how we create those environments that support health and well-being, and thinking how the built environment and transport can support that within a kind of ecological system, not kind of ignoring the fact that this takes place within a broader context of the natural environments, local economy, etc., etc. I think the best example of that, really, of articulating what this means in practice, is probably Marmot's study back in 2010, Fair Society, Healthy Lives, the Marmot Review as it's known. In spatial planning terms then, very much the order of the day, or I would say it still infuses how we spatially plan, is this idea of compact urban form, where policymakers are trying to encourage more sustainable behaviour in transport terms, walking and cycling, through development of space that promotes compact urban form. And that's on the premise that things like walking and cycling are more sensitive to distance, obviously, between activities. So therefore, it is assumed that if we populate areas more densely and we provide a mix of activities within easy walking and cycling distance along a highly connected street network, therefore people will walk and cycle more and leave their cars at home for short journeys, or indeed move to areas where those opportunities arise and they spend less time commuting by car. That's kind of articulated, I feel, very well in towards an urban renaissance. the Urban Task Force produced, which produced that vision of well-designed, compact, connected cities that support a diverse range of land uses and that integrate public transport, walking, cycling, and reduce the need for car use. That very usefully illustrates what that might look like on a planning, at least on paper, relative to the kind of suburban sprawl environments that are produced in the kind of, since the 50s, if you like. And I think it also has to be recognised that land use and spatial planning is the source of travel. It can generate trips. How we design space can encourage movement by different modes of travel. And also the way we configure transport systems can also determine that pattern, the trip distribution. And it's that interaction that's critical. And therefore, it's, as I kind of, when I teach with the urban design students, it's not about just looking at the urban design as such, but it's also looking at the kind of movement space between the kind of, the public squares that they might be designing or the frontages of properties. It's also really important to think about those movement spaces and the interactions between the two. Before I move on to my own research, I just want to kind of chart the kind of totemic pieces of research in this area that have looked at the relationship between transport and spatial planning, or transport and land use. I think Newman and Kenworthy, goes without saying, that's probably the pivotal study in the 80s. They very much looked at density, how, the populace of areas and how that maps onto transport energy use. And they kind of quite starkly illustrated that places like Houston in Texas that are very spread out, very, activities are dispersed. Suburban areas are a fair distance from the central business districts and, basic necessities, versus on the opposite extreme, somewhere like Hong Kong, where higher density of persons per hectare and close to activities on an integrated network. Through looking at that across the piece, across different cities across the world, they've very starkly demonstrated that those kind of places like Houston consume a large amount of transport energy, in this case petroleum, for people to kind of reproduce their everyday lives versus, say, somebody living in Hong Kong. I mean, that's recognised as a major contribution to the research here, that iconic image of private transport energy use versus density. Severo and Cockerman, they have taken that research further really and looked at not only density but diversity and design. And they very much state that the research finds that density, land use, diversity and pedestrian-oriented designs generally reduce trip rates and encourage non-auto travel in statistically significant ways. However, their influences appear to be fairly marginal. So bringing those built environment dimensions, the 3Ds, they kind of highlight that, yes, they're important, but they're kind of marginal influences. And then more recently, we've had an update from Reid Ewing and colleagues looking at Newman and Kenworthy's theory of density and automobile dependence, and very much have kind of looked across US urbanized areas, an array of those areas, 157, and thrown a load of other variables into their multivariate analysis and found out that there's important co-founders, so important influences, if you like, and that relates to personal incomes and highway capacity. So thinking in terms of people's motility, if you like, or potential to move, if they've got a greater income and the highway capacity is there, then there's a predisposition for them to use automobiles. They also highlight that it's not just about, brute density of an area, it's also about distribution of the population in relation to employment and also the land use mix. So adding some complexity to the kind of more simplistic model of the relationship between density and transport energy use. And indeed, Newman and Kenworthy aren't obviously blind to that fact. They do kind of map out those interacting factors based on technologies, economics, infrastructures and urban form. That all has an impact on transport fuel use. And I've just added something in there as well. I mean, I think there's something to be said about cultures of mobility and, society's ideas about what constitutes maybe appropriate mobility or how we should move. Going back to Buchanan's point, it's a societal choice. So just kind of moving down a little bit to walkability, what's been coined as walkability and cyclability of environs. I just want to kind of pick up now on some research I've done in that particular domain. I mean, it's fair to say that research in urban planning and transport has very much focused on this field, but there's increasing interest over the last decade or more from the health sciences, given the concerns about obesogenic environments, sedentary lifestyles, or, in plain speak, does the built environment make people fat, and therefore does it have consequences down the line for public health? I think even there was a document by the Town and Country Planning Association, or was it the RTPI? Don't quote me on that. Called Healthy Weight Environments. So it's quite stark, if you like. So there's been approaches to research in that area, comparing different neighbourhoods, different spatial patterns, and their relative walking cyclability, and comparing kind of travel behaviour. And the research that's fallen out of that from the health research tends to support the hypothesis that built form does affect levels of walking and cycling in different ways. So I just want to focus on one study that I was involved with that interrogated that theory further, and that's the Understanding Walking and Cycling study, along with Lancaster and University of Leeds. So it was a kind of multidisciplinary team of sociologists, anthropologists, spatial planners and transport planners. And we really wanted to look at developing a better understanding of the complexity in which households and individuals make everyday travel decisions about short trips in urban areas, so those trips that are conducive to walking and cycling. I'm not going to put a figure on that because obviously it's subjective, but if I just kind of broadly speaking, let's say 1 to 2 kilometers walking, up to 5 kilometers cycling, that would be kind of a ballpark figure. But really to try and understand how we can provide evidence to policymakers on focus on the neglected areas of micro-scale household decision making. And I'll explain about that in a minute, but obviously there's a built environment context to it, but it's very much about looking at households, how they make decisions about travel. So our approach was, and sorry if this is a bit blurred, it looks a bit stretched on my screen, but we used 4 different cities, so 2 northern cities, Lancaster and Leeds, and in the kind of Midlands, Worcester and Leicester. There's various reasons for selecting those I haven't got time to go into, but we selected those 4 as case studies, and we deployed a series of methods within our overall mixed methods approach. So that's a social survey of residents in those, or a sample rather of residents in those cities, spatial analysis of the density, diversity and network characteristics of those cities. We then took subsamples of families that responded to those social surveys and did interviews as a household unit to understand their everyday mobility. And we also did mobile methods, so following people, accompanying them on car rides, bus journeys, cycle rides, walking, etc., to try and understand their experiences and how they kind of perform their journeys, if you like. And we did a little bit more depth in that. We actually spent time with some families doing ethnography to look at how they kind of constructed their decision making together as a family unit. So lots of data there, as you can imagine, lots of transcripts, and we even have video as well, so quite a lot of information. I'm going to focus more on the spatial aspects, so the social survey and the spatial dimension, given this is about the focus here is spatial planning. So from our survey responses, obviously we've got a lot of information on attitudes to walking and cycling and travel generally, but we also got some gauge of travel behaviour, and we were able to geolocate where those responses came from the respondents' home and their reports of journeys during a typical week. So what we did spatially, we developed a network buffer around the homes of the people that responded, 800 metres for walking and 2,400 metres for cycling, 2.4 kilometres, to represent the average distance covered for a 10-minute walk and a 10-minute cycle ride at 5 kilometres an hour and 15 kilometres an hour respectively. There is a bit of a heuristic behind that, which I won't go into, but I put those on the slide for those that want to read further. But that's where we have to draw a line in the sand and say this is what we're going to do. So that's what we selected, and that enables us to draw, as you can see on the bottom, the middle picture here from somebody's home, which is the red dot. Along those distances, those paths, if you like, we could plot what exists within those kind of on the network within those paths. So, for example, within those network buffers, we could map on the OS master map the different LAN use functions within those buffers, and we use something called Shannon's entropy index to look at the diversity, the number and absolute diversity of those what we might regard as essential services within walking and cycling distance of people's homes. We also measured the connectivity of the network within the buffer, so intersections, street density, something called the average degree, so various measures of how linked in that section of the network is to other parts of the network, which I've tried to visualize using people here and their kind of social networks, if you like. And then we use some sort of global measures of centrality. So you probably heard of like space syntax. It's kind of broadly on that principle, developed by Sergio Porter and all at Strathclyde. But that basically, in general terms, looks at the relation of a point in space. So let's say an intersection or a junction. Where is that relative to all other spaces in the network, and how central is it in that space? And so those centrality measures, we used other measures as well, which again I haven't got time to go into, but you know, generally that was like kind of thinking about you being the person of the bridge between two different parts of the city, or if you're a junction, or being close, how close are you to other junctions in the city, or how much are you in a straight line with others as the crow flies. So different measures of centrality, all have got their strengths and weaknesses, but it gives us an indication generally about the centrality of space, point space. We could then assign all of those values that we measured to properties or plots on the network, given their relationship to the frontage of their property to the network, and plot that visually in a diagram. So you can see here for Lancaster, a betweenness centrality and a closeness centrality, where red here on the closeness shows you the places that are close to all other points on the network, and then not surprisingly those in blue are least linked to the network. So that's kind of not a surprising diagram, what you'd expect really. And obviously people who are familiar with Lancaster will probably pull that apart and think about some of those streets and what colour they are. But anyway, it gives a general visualization of what we mean by centrality. In summary, what we found was, in terms of access to activities, there was a positive, though weak, correlation between access to activities and frequency of walking journeys. Okay, so there was a correlation, but it's weak between, you know, living somewhere that's very connected, diverse in the network, and levels of walking. With regard to cycling, there was no correlation at all between, you know, being in somewhere that's highly connected, highly diverse, and your level of cycling. So some positivity for walking, no correlation for cycling. In terms of the street network on the local measures, positive though weak correlation with street density and walking, but no correlation with cycling. Again, no correlation with cycling, and no apparent correlation between intersection density for either walking or cycling. But the picture for walking is mixed. On the global measures, the centrality measures, we had a positive correlation between all of those, between this closeness for walking, but not much evidence that either are significant for cycling. So overall, what it paints is a picture of, you know, does the built environment affect cycling on those kind of measures that are perceived or hypothesized rather to promote walking? Yes, to some degree, though there's a weak correlation. Do they promote and support cycling? Though we didn't find any evidence of that. So in conclusion then, for that for the Understanding Walking and Cycling Social Survey and the linked spatial analysis, we conclude that presence and diversity of activities, and particularly network connectivity, are only weakly associated with frequency of walking trips, and there appears to be no relationship with cycling. What does that mean for policymakers? Does it mean we should give up, forget spatial planning influence? Well, of course not. It just suggests that these design elements are important, but they're insufficient on their own to affect behaviour change, at least in the UK context. And it's that combination of measures that is required that make walking and cycling short distances the default option for many. It's a combination of measures. So just to kind of summarise really, we also, you're probably thinking, well, what did you do with all of the other data? Well, there's lots of analysis in the Understanding Walking and Cycling report, but we also did some discourse analysis using something called Q methodology, which looks at the kind of discourses from our interviews around moving around the city and walking and cycling and driving. And we found 3 global spheres, if you like, of, if you think global ideas, this isn't like groups of people, this is ideas set into 3 discourses. So the first one is what we call cycling sanctifiers, and these are people that talk very much about confidence in sharing the roads with cars, and they appreciate the freedom, speed and convenience of cycling, and they're content with their current cycling practice. Pedestrian privatisers discourse, on the other hand, they support more restrictions on car use in urban areas. Then they support cycling, but they themselves are pretty uneasy cycling in traffic, and they fully support segregated cycle infrastructure to support them to cycle. Automobile adherents, they're content with their current mobile practice, and that could include some walking and cycling, I might add, because they're interviewed because they do walk and cycle. They believe most people can exercise choice, that mobility is a choice and you can just choose how you want to move. They support cycling and walking. However, they've got a huge caveat to that, as long as it doesn't impinge on their motoring. So an example of that, they might not support slower speeds or low traffic neighbourhoods because it infringes on their car mobility. So that's a challenge really for policymakers, because there's general sympathy with the aim to get more people walking and cycling and travelling more sustainably across all discourses in our research. But everyday cycling from our research showed that that's currently performed by the confident and committed who've adopted the necessary coping strategies within the UK transport system as it's designed at the moment. What we might call the survivalists, they've learned to survive in the system. We know typically young, male, fit, etc. Also that the choice agenda, and that was very much epitomised in our Worcester case study. They have very much had that strapline, choose how you move, plastered around the city. That campaign's questionable because people recognise that it is really not a choice, because moving around is relational. Your way of moving is impacts others, and other people's ways of moving impact your way of moving. So cycling's a classic case of that in terms of interactions with motor traffic. So yeah, I mean, we discussed that more in the report about the kind of more sophisticated dialogue needed with the public in order to develop the mandate that Bannister talks about to get a sustainable mobility paradigm, on the ground, constructed. Yeah, and I'm running out of time, so you can read more about the broader findings in our Promoting Walking and Cycling book, or there's a downloadable report which you can click on this link that gives a summary. But yeah, some of the practical things from that are physical environment changes, but also reducing trip distances, as well as the kind of social dimensions that we talk very much about. Other research, just to summarise, we did actually go a bit deeper into cycling experiences. So this is from the Cycle Boom study, where we did a bit more mobile methods with people in Oxford, how they experience moving around. And we just generally found a discontent, risky business effectively moving around with large vehicles particularly, and dissatisfaction with the quality of infrastructure, even in a so-called cycling city. Anxiety being forced onto spaces with pedestrians and like feeling really kind of uneasy about that, and lack of coherence about knowing what to do in expected manoeuvres. And then really some, downright law breaking, which that kind of cartoon shows actually, somebody just skipping the traffic lights and saying, well, I'm doing this to, for my own safety. And, it seemed ridiculous waiting at a red light when it doesn't change for like 2 minutes and there's no traffic. All those sorts of discourses amongst the older people that we were doing our research with. And then we provided some recommendations around that. So please do have a look at the report in terms of how we can create that kind of cycle system. So in summary then, I recently gave a talk at Oxford actually with the Global Centre for Urban Healthcare, I think it's called. And they framed the question, how can cycling and walking be encouraged as healthy, sustainable and safe mode of transport for short journeys in urban areas? So, I mean, I kind of very much summarised that from that research that I've just set out, and my reading of other research is, first of all, reducing the car's widespread dominance of urban space. because at the moment transport system is stacked against sustainable modes. Also to normalise cycling, which very much came out in the understanding walking and cycling research, particularly amongst our Lancaster participants, that cycling and walking is seen as abnormal, or something that, well, as one person put it, feeling like a second-class citizen. So, and also we need to disregard the notion of vehicular cycling that only caters for what I call a velomobile elite. I've kind of written on that about how we do just cater for that, the survivalist or the velomobile elite that's been shaped by UK and US transport thinking in the past. So that requires obviously building a proper cycling and walking system. It requires that leap in ambition that I think we're starting to see now, and obviously people like Chris Boardman have been instrumental in that. And then also thinking about finally embracing and integrating electric micromobility. I appreciate there's lots of dissonance around that, but there's huge potential for electric cycles to democratise cycling and also at the same time promote health and particularly mental well-being. So yeah, I think I've run out of time, so I'll end it there, but please do refer to the documents I've cited if you require further information, or you can email me at tjones@brooks. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim. That was a really interesting presentation. Yeah, thank you for presenting. We've got a few questions in the chat. I'll just run through them briefly. Obviously conscious we are short of time. I think the first one was around the lack of correlation for cycling related to infrastructure quality. Is there a correlation or a lack of? And the second one was around was the quality of intersection accounted for? So pedestrian facilities at a junction or no safe way to turn right for cyclists, was this accounted for in the research?
Yeah, that's a really important, very important question, because obviously along the built environment measures, there's a whole regulatory environment that shapes how those spaces are designed. So the answer to your question is no, and that is a limitation of the research, that given the kind of city spatial scale that we were working on, it was nigh impossible, or we would have required a load of resources to actually go and get that level of detail across the network. But yeah, it's an important point, really. It almost needs to be a hybrid research between what we try to do and then the kind of more micro level walkability, cyclability studies that are done on a kind of segment basis, if you like. But yeah, very good point, an important point.
Yeah, no, agreed. And I think another point just to touch upon is around having colour coding on road signage indicating levels of risk from air pollution the previous week, acting as a sort of strong motivator for authorities to act in protecting cyclists and walkers. So just want to gauge your opinion on sort of air pollution and what we can do about that as a barrier to walking and cycling.
Yeah, that's a big debate, isn't it? Because I think what we found on our research is we found that people kind of found their own geographies of walking and cycling away from main roads, but obviously that there's a paradox there in that a lot of land use functions are along main roads, so that's particularly where we want to support people to walk and cycle. However, that is also an issue in terms of air pollution, because those are the corridors where air pollution is most prevalent. So, I mean, all I could say with that is, because that can scupper ideas of promoting walking and cycling, is that technological change is obviously going to help that in terms of reducing car use and also shifts to electric vehicles. So it's how walking and cycling can coexist amongst technological change, but ensuring we're embedding those walking and cycling systems within our towns and cities rather than having to exist around the car infrastructure, so to speak. So yeah, lots of separated, properly designed junctions for walking and cycling that take those considerations into account, but also thinking of those kind of wider transitional changes that will happen, which will reduce air pollution.
Yeah, definitely. No, I totally agree, Tim. Really, really good. And finally, I suppose just come on to a final point. Do you think there is a risk the rise of electric vehicles could imperil active travel ambitions? Absolutely.
So that's a point I made at the Oxford debate that we had in December. That is the kind of elephant in the room, really, because there is a danger that people into transport think job done. You know, we've had that technological shift in fuel type, but it doesn't deal with the kind of other issues, obviously road incidents, crashes, but also the intense use of space by vehicles. There's also a danger of that creep, if you like, because we have low emission zones. But what does it mean when we're at kind of 70%, let's say, critical mass of electric vehicles? Are all those policies done away with? Because, of course, we've solved the air pollution and fuel issue. I would argue, no, it doesn't. We still need to work on a trajectory of trying to reduce the need to travel and reducing the domination of cities by private car. Okay, so that's not anti-car. That's just looking at a broader mobility palette and to think about the multiple uses and how we can use space more productively.
Perfect. No, thank you, Tim, and thank you for your time today. I think the presentation was really good and really good comments from attendees, and would encourage, obviously, if attendees have any further questions, to contact you. Just before I introduce the next presentation, I will confirm that the presentation is recorded, as for all the presentations on this. So yeah, do feel free to access this following the presentation on TFN's website. So thank you, Tim, for your time. That was perfect. Brilliant. I'm moving on now just to introduce Guilherme Rodriguez and Anthony Breach from the Centre for Cities, who are going to give a talk on measuring up comparing public transport in the UK and Europe's biggest cities. Thank you.
All right. Hi, everyone. Just to introduce myself, my name is Anthony. I'm a senior analyst here at Centre for Cities, where I lead on housing and planning.
I'm Guy. I'm a researcher for the Centre, joined last year and mostly work on transport and productivity issues across British cities.
This one, we're just getting our slides up, and let's get that working. Slideshow. Just those are the ones down here. Yep. Got it. All right, great. So I'm going to talk for a little bit to introduce the context of the research. Guilherme is going to take you through the analysis. I'm going to talk a little bit about the recommendations at the end. So just to kind of give you a kind of quick summary of kind of what our research shows is basically public transport accessibility in big British cities is much lower than what their population would suggest. And it's also much lower than the equivalent sized large cities in the rest of Western Europe. And that seems to be, in some places, due to a lack of public transport infrastructure. Like, some of these networks are smaller than their Western European peers. But we can also see that the big difference across all of our cities that are large is that they are much less dense than large European cities. And this reduces the amount of people who can access the city centre within a reasonable time frame for their commute. And by extension, it reduces the concentration of jobs that can be achieved in the city centre. And then, as an extension from that, it reduces the size of the economy and agglomeration effects that we see in big European cities, and therefore contributes to the unusually large regional divides that we see across the UK. And therefore, when thinking about levelling up and public transport and some of the discourse around that, we need to not just be thinking about laying more track and building more trams, but we also need to be thinking about changing the built form of big UK cities to improve public transport accessibility. So just to give you some context about kind of how Centre for Cities thinks about urban economies and why we have such a bad regional divide in the UK. The UK seems to be quite unusual when we compare it to other European countries, in that while in the rest of Europe there's a relationship where as cities get larger, their productivity increases. We don't see that in the UK. So London is obviously very large and very productive, but places like Manchester, Birmingham, Newcastle, Sheffield, Liverpool, other large cities in the UK aren't as productive as we might expect from their size. And this has a knock-on effect for both their local economies, obviously, but then also the national economy as well. And we've done some modelling to suggest that if the kind of bigger cities in the UK were performing at their full potential, which is suggested by the size of their population, then there'd be £48 billion or more in national economic output, which could then fund other government priorities and also improve living standards both locally and nationally. So Guilherme is going to talk through the method of how we've investigated this relationship between public transport and levelling up.
So to do the analysis to understand the quality of public transport in the UK, as Anthony was saying, we looked at the network size, the effective size, the population density, all these factors. So if you see on the left-hand side, of my slide, I have the footprint of Birmingham, of the areas that you can reach the city center, the purple dot, in 30 minutes or less. So you can see that the closest areas from the city center you can reach in 30 minutes, and then you have some pockets, some islands, which tend to be train stations that you can still reach the city center in 30 minutes. So our measure of quality of transport in the analysis is what we call transport accessibility. So from the overall population of Birmingham and all the other cities, what is the share of people that can reach the city center in 30 minutes or less? And the transport accessibility or the quality, it depends on the network size. So how many bus stations and trams and trains you have, which is basically the area that you can see on the map, the overall area, but also how many people we have living in those areas, so the density. And you can see that, for example, for Birmingham, most places have less than 5,000 residents per square kilometer. And as a combination of this, the density, which we would call the demand side of transport, so how many people live next to a train station, the demand, and the network size, which is the supply, how many public transport supply exists in the city, the connection of those two give you the effective size, so how many people in the city can, how many million or thousand people can reach the city center, and how British city compares with Western European ones. So for the analysis, we do not consider factors such as service quality, frequency, and price. And our data is from peak time in the morning on Monday, the 26th of July last year. So the headline idea from here is that in Western European cities that we compared, around 7 people out of 10 can reach their city centers in 30 minutes or less by public transport, while in the UK just 4 out of 10. So it's almost half of what we observe in Western European cities. And if you compare the cities, the UK cities with European ones with similar sizes, you can see a constant underperformance. So you can see that the first 2 bars, so population below 1 million in Western European cities, on average, at least 7 to 9 people can reach the city center out of 10, while in the UK, for any size, it's less than half. Paris and London perform quite low, but they are mega cities, so their size sometimes like 10 to 15 times larger than the other cities. Earnings are very high in those places, and we know from data people are willing to commute longer periods to access those specific labor markets. So if transport transport accessibility is low in the UK, if we look at individual cities, you can see here comparing the cities to the European average of similar size cities, that Glasgow is the only city that has a similar performance to the European average. Then you can say after Glasgow, the smaller cities in our sample, Liverpool, Nottingham, and Bristol, they underperform, but the gap, it's slightly smaller than the other ones. And surprisingly, at least for us, is that we don't see a strong relationship between public transport underperformance and existing infrastructure. For example, we know that Leeds doesn't have any tram or metro system, but it performs in line with a city like Sheffield and slightly below Newcastle that we know that have metro and tram systems. So Glasgow is the only city with comparable accessibility. That said, when we compare the footprint from the first slide, the size of the green area that is covering 30 minutes, the story is a little bit more nuanced. So cities like Glasgow and Birmingham, the overall network size is actually larger than their European peers. Same for Newcastle, comparable in cities like Nottingham and Bristol. So the only cities that we see a clearly strong underperformance in terms of network size is Manchester, Sheffield, and Leeds. So why do we have this mismatch between how many people can access the city center by public transport and the size of the network? It's mostly about the demand and the density. So the European cities, you can see the larger the city is, so a city with less than 750,000 residents it has lower density than a city with more than 1 million residents within its core center, the area around the city center, and that can reach in 30 minutes or less by public transport. While in the UK, the relationship, it's almost non-existent. So the larger the city gets, so from Liverpool to Manchester, we don't see very different density patterns. While in a country, for example, like France, you see that Paris is denser than Lyon, Lyon is denser than Marseille, and Marseille is denser than Toulouse. And we don't have that clear relationship between the British largest cities, with the exception of London. So visually, we can see here that Milan and Manchester, the area covered by the public transport network in 30 minutes is pretty similar, but Milan can attract as 1.1 million people living in that area, while in Manchester it's around 500,000. So roughly half of the people in the same area, which is, we would call it prime area because it has the easiest access to city center and jobs. The reason for that, it's about population density, and as you can see here, Milan rarely have areas with fewer than 5,000 residents per square kilometer in this area, and the ones it has, they are mostly on the fringes, on the edges of the area, while in Manchester we don't see a strong relationship. So some central areas are low density, the densest areas are quite far from the city center, and the combination of these factors, we can see that the effective size of Manchester in the 30 minutes public transport belt, it's half of Milan's one, while the population relation is much closer. So visually, we picked two photos from areas around 15 minutes from the city center by public transport. The left one is Milan, the right one is Manchester, and you can see visually how density plays a role. So we have these like mid-size apartment blocks in Milan without space next to each other, so which allows much more density without skyscrapers, while on the Manchester example we see mostly just houses with a garden and like with a much more sprawly and low density environment.
And to take a kind of second case study, where instead looking at a city with a smaller public transport network than its peer, looking at Leeds versus Marseille, we can see that Leeds and Marseille both have a similar sized population, but Leeds has a much smaller share of the population that can reach the city centre within 30 minutes. So only about 38% of Leeds can do so, compared to 87% of the population can in Marseille. And this, we argue that this corresponds to Leeds' relatively poor economic performance compared to Marseille, in that the city centre cannot achieve high concentrations of workers, of jobs, of firms and activity, because it's difficult and unreasonable to commute to the city centre and achieve capacity and scale in doing so. And although kind of Leeds famously does not have a metro, and Marseille has a quite comprehensive system, we can see that if we add the same amount of network size, so we kind of have a comparable size network to what Marseille has, it actually only adds another 23% of the population of Leeds to that effective size of Leeds, and can now access the city centre within 30 minutes. And the remaining 26%, so over half of the gap, is actually still out of reach of the city centre within 30 minutes. And this seems to be the case that this is due to the lack of density within Leeds' suburbs, and especially kind of a lack of density around train stations and future kind of metro stations. Again, we can see this visually. You can use your eyeballs. if you go to a Marseille and Leeds, that 5 minutes from the central station within Marseille, you see kind of mid-rise apartment buildings, as you can see on the left. Again, you can see right next to Marseille's metro there on the left. Whereas on the right, we have semi-detached kind of terrace housing, which effectively caps the population within that particular neighborhood, and therefore caps the amount of demand for public transport within that neighborhood, and therefore reduces the ability of the public transport network to supply riders that can support its operation. So that's kind of like a very kind of spatial and kind of transport planning focused way of looking at this. But what does this mean for the levelling up agenda and for economic change and renewal in our big northern cities? And what we find is that if you think back to that chart I showed you at the beginning, where we can see that the UK is unusual in that as cities their population increases, they don't become more productive. If you, instead of looking at the population, instead look at the effective size of cities, which is the number of workers that can access the city centre within 30 minutes by public transport, actually we start to see a pattern that makes more sense, because the effective size of British large cities is so small that they correspond to much smaller cities in Europe than their population would suggest. So, for example, Manchester and Rome both have a similar level of total population in their size, but Rome is about 57% more productive than Manchester. However, if you look at the effective size of Manchester compared to other European cities, Manchester is actually much closer to Dortmund, which is a small German city in the Ruhr, kind of a post-industrial city, and we can see that actually it closes the gap down to 12% in terms of overall output and productivity. So broadly altogether, this shows that actually access to the city centre, quickly, conveniently, cheaply and at scale, which is in turn affected by the built environment of the suburbs, has an impact on productivity and economic performance. And we've done some simple sums to kind of estimate, at least the order of magnitude for these effects, and we reckon it costs at least 23.1 billion pounds a year. So, do you want to do case studies?
Yeah.
Okay, go.
So, in terms of intercity connectivity, so connectivity by train, for example, or bus from one city to another, we can see that the density also plays a role and make this type of investments less effective in the UK than other Western European cities. So, for example, Leeds and Manchester, if we consider the population living close to the main train station, though that would be an area of 9 square kilometers, which the center would be in the train station, both cities combined would have just around 3% of the population living there. So even if you have high-speed rail connectivity between the cities, you have to take into account that people do not live close to the train stations. They may need to park and ride or using public transport to reach the city. So, and even if we are more generous and if we consider how many people can reach the city center by 30 minutes and then using the high-speed rail, this would be a commute around 60 to 70 minutes, which is already twice the national average. The population of both cities, the large majority would be still outside that range, only 25% of the population. And we see the same story about density when we compare some cities like Leeds and Marseille. The 30 minutes density, 30 minutes public transport density, it's mostly the same as the density around the core train stations. Yeah. And we don't observe that in Western European cities. So there's a premium of being in the 30 minutes public transport area, which is closer to the city center, and that's why it's denser. And that's an extra premium, which reflects on more residents living there in the areas next to the core station. So you can see that density on those areas is 4 to 5 times larger than in Leeds and Marseille. So you can see population living in 9 square kilometers in Marseille and Milan to be above 100,000, while in Leeds and Manchester it's like 50 to 40,000.
So just to take through kind of the conclusions and recommendations that we've drawn from this research. So basically, we think that connectivity to city centres by public transport is a factor behind the UK's regional divides. It doesn't explain the entire productivity gap, so things like skills, commercial property, local leadership all matter as well. But it does, to the extent that it plays a role, as access towards the city centre. There's little evidence that private vehicle infrastructure is an issue in UK's largest cities. We've got charts on this that show 100% of the population can reach a city centre within 30 minutes by car. But simply expanding kind of these existing public transport networks or shifting towards more car travel will not increase the size of the labour market that can reach the city centre within 30 minutes. We will need to densify, especially the very largest cities such as Birmingham and Manchester, if we want to close the north-south divide. So while we should be kind of building a new public transport network in places like Leeds or expanding it in Birmingham and Manchester, unless densification happens as well, we won't be able to address the effective size problem that a lot of large cities in the UK, all of the large cities in the UK experience. It also means that if we're thinking about intercity travel, including kind of high-speed 2, also things like Northern Powerhouse Rail, we have to be thinking about densifying the land around stations quite considerably if we want to maximise the benefits for those cities and for the national economy. There's a separate strand of work which we've been working on, which I've been leading on, which identifies that actually the barrier, the reason why we don't have this densification near stations, is because our discretionary case-by-case planning system, which is extremely unusual internationally and doesn't exist in the rest of Europe, makes densification extremely difficult. It means that decisions are taken to put new homes in the most politically acceptable places rather than in the places where it makes the best sense for town planning outcomes. And the consequence of that is it's very difficult to demolish existing housing stock and to build newer, denser and more climate-friendly houses in their stead. So to kind of advance levelling up and to improve public transport accessibility, we argue that public transport investment and funding, especially from central government, should be linked to densification commitments from cities and from the local authorities as well. Now, that's, as mentioned, quite difficult under the current planning system, but we argue that local government already has the power to do this by issuing local development orders, which are non-discretionary form of planning consent, which would take out a lot of the case-by-case decision-making and make it more rules-based and predictable, and making densification easier, as well as releasing land around the green belt next to stations for site allocations and for conventional development built to have a considerable density. So we shouldn't just be using LDOs around brand new infrastructure. We should be deploying them along the existing networks as well, where we already have these big problems around density. And new investment in public transport should be conditional on some deployment of local development orders in the meantime. We're also very supportive of the planning reforms that are kind of being brought forward. We think that they would improve certainty and reduce the case-by-case decision-making, which causes a number of problems for the UK's urban economies. And we argue that certainly on the proposals included within the white paper would support densification and thereby improve public transport accessibility in the long run. So if we were to move towards a rules-based planning system, and we had a more kind of flexible zoning system, as our previous work has shown, it would then become possible to, especially with local government reform ideas that we've also suggested, to move towards unitaries and kind of more mayoral leadership, to begin thinking about how to integrate local plans and local transport plans and make them essentially the same document, and thereby achieve more effective planning outcomes, as well as more transport planning outcomes, as well as more effective spatial and land development problems. So happy to take some questions. There's some extra charts there for the real enthusiasts, but we'll have to send the slides around later and discuss take any questions anyone has.
Thank you, Guilherme and Anthony, for that presentation. That was really, really interesting. There are quite a few questions in the chat, so I'll go through. I think we've got about 7 minutes to touch upon a few of them. So I think the first question we have was the 30 minutes that you modelled in your work. Did this include the walk to the nearest public transport stop?
Yes. Yeah.
Straightforward answer. Would you say the difference between London and the South East versus elsewhere is a lot due to skills and not just density and connectivity? And did you control for labour force composition dimension in your analysis?
We didn't control for labour force composition. I mean, because there's a bit of we've been discussing as well, kind of Henry Overman's professor at the LSE, just kind of works a lot on similar topics to us. And he had a kind of a similar point. And our response was, yes, of course, like, there is kind of a skills competition point. There is more kind of city centre, high skilled work taking place within London. But if we're thinking about how do we actually kind of transform the kind of the performance of the kind of big northern cities, and we do need more skills and kind of more skilled workers in the north for that to happen. It also needs to be the case that those skilled workers can actually reach the city centre in the first place. So there's a bit of a kind of chicken and egg problem with skills and with transport there. And while any kind of levelling up program has to include kind of a skills component, I think we sort of focused on the transport side in this to try and understand kind of what the transport mechanisms at play here.
Yeah, no, perfect. I couldn't agree more. Are there differences in public transport travel costs in deregulated environments like metropolitan areas versus regulated and integrated public transport in European cities? And could cost and level of integration be a factor too?
What would you say, Guillaume, of like whether kind of costs and integration of the service is a barrier?
We think that it could have an effect, but when we did the analysis in the report at public transport take-ups as a function of the accessibility scores, we don't see a chronic underperformance of British cities, which is the kind of thing that we would expect if price was driving accessibility down in a chronic way. So there's in fact some cities that they do have low public transport take-ups, like 15% to commute. But one of the main reasons is that most of the people are not within the range. When you compare a city like Manchester to a city with a similar public transport system, let's say Palermo in Italy, the take-ups are not that different, and we don't see it a chronic underperformance. The only city that was very, very below the average was Bristol, but the data is from the previous census, and we know from bus take-ups that probably those numbers are higher today than what they were in 2011.
Yeah, Bristol also has an unusual amount of walking as
Yes.
well. I mean, I think the way in which we sort of came to the conclusion about that was, weirdly, given how low public transport accessibility is in large British cities, take-up is unusually high. Like it's much lower than like other cities with better public transport accessibility, but it's above the trend line, which to us sort of suggests that the boot fits, right? That we actually have a reasonably efficient kind of public transport network, given the low accessibility that we have. And really the density is kind of the binding constraint shaping, commuters' behaviour and transport behaviour. We are kind of big advocates for kind of more like London-style integrated transport systems. We've been pushing for the mayors to have that power. We're big supporters of kind of bus franchising as well. So I think certainly that kind of quality of life, and you could get that share even higher. But really, this is sort of the bottleneck is urban density.
So just to add on that, a city like Manchester, if it performs like Palermo, our argument is that it should be performing like Rome. And if the take-ups won't be that as high as Rome, it's one of the potential reasons is like the lack of bus franchising, integration, all these policies that you see in most Western European cities. But I don't think that one factor would offset the other, because if people don't live next to public transport and good quality public transport, even if it was much cheaper, we wouldn't see a significant increase in take-ups.
Yep, perfect. Thank you. Conscious we've got run out of time, there's quite a few questions. There's a few questions around sort of the politics of all this, and the sort of the assertion of the planning system, and how it's obviously the political class often object to such development. I suppose just to summarise, obviously if this is down to the UK preferring people to live in flats, if people in the UK prefer to live in houses rather than flats, is there anything the UK can do the government can do to sort of change the sort of social behaviour or influence sort of what people prefer and obviously change the attitude towards this densification in the UK?
Yeah, I mean, my first step would be, I think it's easier for the government to change institutions than it is to change behaviour or culture. I mean, I think if there's kind of cultural changes kind of happening, when we sort of see this renaissance and return to the city, then that's really good, and we're enthusiasts for that. But I think our argument about how the planning system operates in this dimension is systemically the way in which it actually makes decisions about how land is used and how development takes place makes it even harder than it really should be to build new houses new flats next to train stations, right? Or to build new houses next to kind of greenbelt stations. So obviously the politics of planning reform are complicated, I think, as everyone on this call understands, but with a system that's very confrontational, that's very unpredictable, that really empowers kind of objectors and reinforces the status quo. When we know that kind of other planning systems around the world, like we like kind of flexible zoning systems, like Japan's, for instance, where you can still have democratic input, and that's kind of front loaded into the creation of a local plan. But then once the rules are agreed, then you can build whatever kind of complies with those rules. And shifting towards that kind of framework, I think you could keep most people certainly on board with kind of the system, and I think also just have better transport, better housing outcomes in the round.
Yeah, totally agree, and recognise it as a challenging challenge to overcome. Okay, so probably leave that there now. I'd like to thank you both, Guilherme and Anthony, for that presentation. To remind all attendees that obviously the session is recorded and we can provide slides following the meeting. And if there's any sort of specific questions to any of the speakers, then please do contact them via the email details that is provided. So thank you both, really interesting. And so our final talk is by Dr. Philip Rode of the London School of Economics, and Philip's going to be talking about the integrated governance for transport and land use planning. Thanks, Philip.
Thank you very much, Colm. So this means changing gear slightly, moving us away from a substantive understanding of what is happening in our towns and cities and around transport into the question of processes and governance and institutions. So let me do the screen share here. I hope this will come through in a second. Can I just hear whether colleagues can see this?
Yeah, that's all fine, Philip. Thank you.
All right, perfect. So I'll be focusing on some lessons around this rather grand idea of integrated transport and the governance thereof, based on experiences that have emerged from Berlin and London pretty much since the 1990s, when I guess a new sort of paradigm of urban development really was adjusting itself more to what we had heard from Tim earlier as well. Now, the way I'm going to use integrated transport in some ways is twofold. On the one hand, we of course appreciate the term as something that at a minimum really thinks around across all the different transport modes and tries to join them up. But beyond that, and equally important, it is about integrating mobility and transport with accessibility and therefore land use, and the much broader question of how to make cities and regions more accessible, as we have also just seen in the previous presentation. And we heard from Tim up front that it's widely appreciated and often deeply frustrating that we continue having quite entrenched missing links between, yes, transport policy and planning on the one side, but then there's urban planning, and even then the link to the three-dimensional, the question of architecture, urban design, city design, where questions about the actual use of individual buildings and their urban form are featured, and these links are rarely being catered for, not least because we have, of course, been going through an intense form of putting silos in place that advance very technical disciplines around these different sectors and domains of urban planning. So what this presentation also does, it shifts us away from the what and into the realm of how to advance urban sustainability at a very broad level, because that ultimately, that's what urban transport and accessibility is all about. It's one of the most fundamental contributors to urban sustainability, and through that shift, we're then, of course, getting right to the heart of this question of integrated urban governance. Now, stepping back from our particular agenda, it's important to say that the sort of phenomenon of discussing and almost celebrating integration as something universally desirable has, of course, experienced a massive contribution through the environmental movement. And these are sort of maybe the most relevant recent, since the late 1980s, reports that we are all referencing or thinking about. And they all make a very strong and very direct case for joining up policy practice, joining up policy sectors, and thinking about development in a more holistic and integrated way. So that's the broader framework. And the case for integration is quite sticky. It's been around for some time, and it's almost like the eternal debate in public policy and administrative sciences. But there are also elements, just like the environmental perspective, which have further elevated the need to discuss it and ideally also to implement new ways of doing things. So yes, the environmental crisis and the understanding of wicked problems which aren't really neatly organized around our existing silos of intervening in public policy around health or education or indeed land use, transport and so on, in some ways require a different logic. We have also all seen, working on cities, the emergence of a very strong strategic planning narrative, the idea of avoiding complete comprehensive approaches, but also not trusting incrementalism and sort of strategic planning, trying to square the middle. And in that context, the idea of strong policy coherence, spatial policy coherence is quite central. When the major institutions in London and also in Berlin were reformed, they were also building their sort of ideas around what was a very strong narrative emerging through a lot of efforts by the European Union at the time about spatial integration, not only within city regions, but of course across broader regional development. And in an interesting way, we sort of coming back to this, and the leveling up is not that unrelated to some rather grand efforts which the EU has been trying to pursue for some time. Cities are ultimately built around integrated returns. We have just heard this, and if we don't address those integrated returns, we are actually missing out on the main urban opportunity. And integration failures are, of course, quite relevant in that context. And then the last point, and you know, for those that have been following the Tony Blair efforts around modernizing government, they'll remember these very strong cases that we need to move away from silo-based policymaking and really structure our politics around the grand challenges, also the challenges as they are perceived by the population we are servicing. Now, why integration? Much more pragmatically, this should be fairly familiar to all of you, because this is a cross-cutting concern, not just in transport spatial development, but even if you run a small organization, these things always come back. We want to, of course, take advantage of synergetic effects and improve in the public domain policy coherence, avoid blind spots and inefficient duplication. Poor sequencing is a big problem as well. Social learning, really enabling each other, the transport planner, to understand architecture, urban design, and vice versa, and also allow the general public to maybe engage in some of those more technical conversations, and then ultimately break the organizational lock-in, which is really putting a brake on innovation as well. Now, before getting a bit into the practices and some of the key findings, when we use this broad term of integration, and you'll find it even very specifically applied in the context of transport policy, it often isn't very clear what it actually is talking about. And there are at least three different types of integration we should differentiate right up front. One is system integration, which is very much about joining up the technical artifacts, the socio-spatial system, make sure that high density coincides with locations of great public transport access. That's all part of systems integration. Then there's target integration, where, of course, in the sustainability domain for some time, we are embracing, besides economic and social objectives, environmental ones, and are continuing to add additional outcomes to our policy-making effort. And that's a form of embracing these new outcomes, or then target integration. And finally, and that's the one I will be speaking to, there's governance integration, typically at the most basic level, differentiated in two ways. The vertical integration, when it's public policy, it's about the different tiers of the state communicating clearly from the supranational, national, all the way down to your local neighborhood. That's quite central. And the horizontal, which is a combination of across sectors, as well as neighboring regions. So these sort of forms of then governance integration. And that's, of course, what I'm now going to go into. It leads to this fundamental question of how can collective action be coordinated? And as I said at the beginning, that's not particularly novel to pose this question. Many good books have been published on this. And very broadly, there's sort of an understanding somehow markets, hierarchies, or networks can sort it. Now, as I'll focus here on very interventionist public sector domains, we'll stick to the tensions and synergies between hierarchies and networks. In a nutshell, you know, the hierarchy, top-down command structures, perfection maybe most in the military, and networks, the more maybe agile, horizontal development or structuring of organizations. And we'll hear in a moment how in then the key cities, Berlin and London, that tension has played out. Now, another warning I have to make here, this connection between institutions on the one hand and broad political systems and how they operate and how we organize mayor's office and how we subdivide different ministries or administrations, all the way down to then policy outcomes, is a massively complex spectrum. And even with the most sophisticated sort of econometric model, it will be very hard to make strong claims exactly about what is the outcome of a particular institutional arrangement. So we need to be careful of over-interpreting these relations, which go into both ways. So, of course, our political system and the governance structures inform policymaking and outcomes, but also our ambition around policy outcomes for maybe a more joined-up transport system feedback, and we then feel we need to reform the institutions that oversee the delivery. What is more helpful for the work I'm going to present here is to think about policy capacities rather than outcomes, and policy capacity and ability to really address a particular challenge or a sector. That can be traced much better directly back to an institutional arrangement. So let me come to the two cities. So really starting with their institutional, but also then urban development experience since the 1990s. I mean, large European cities, of course, London significantly larger than Berlin. They are at their core quite compact and, of course, quite public transport oriented, which is important to say up front. And they have enjoyed considerable infrastructure investments, which, of course, had to be governed. Berlin, a bit more post-reunification in the 1990s, and London, as we all know, particularly since the sort of Transport for London and the Mayor for London as an institution was established, and national government was giving significant amount of funding to the city. Now, what has happened, certainly as a result of some of those policy decisions, alongside, of course, a changing population and broader societal trends, is a quite considerable change in mobility behavior. Here, one way of measuring the modal shift, this is what it was in 1990s, and let's look where we came to in 2013. You can see in both cities a considerable reduction of car use. I'm going back and forth here. In the case of London, from 44% down to 32%. It depends a bit how you measure here. This is based on trips. London broadly bringing a lot of those trips into public transport. In Berlin, by contrast, a massive increase in walking and cycling up to that point. Of course, today this would already look quite different. So if we are now curious about, alongside the cultural changes in these cities, were there any really important governance reforms that enabled policy that may have taken on the narrative which Tim shared with us earlier on, the sustainable transport or integrated system transport approach? And the answer is quite clearly yes. So I spent almost a decade talking to a lot of different people in both cities, from sort of the key policymakers, from the mayor, all the way down to people who are on the operational side. And you learn a couple of really interesting points here. The first one is back to this issue of hierarchy and networks, where conventionally you would say it's an either or. And both cities actually relied on a very intelligent, sophisticated hybrid model of bringing the two together. In fact, both cities, Berlin and London, centralized a lot of the authority around this space, planning, urban design, transport, around, in the London case, of course, the mayor, in the Berlin case, around a senator for urban development, which, may go a bit against the big storytelling about flat hierarchies and networks. Having said this, in the what we call sort of the shadow of those new hierarchies, we are seeing a lot of cross-fertilization. Colleagues, younger generation colleagues that really make the phone calls across departments, across different units, and are more enabled also through team efforts to communicate below or across the very strong hierarchies. A second important finding is that none of the cities displayed this one big bang of a major integration fix, a complete radical reform, although you may think, German reunification, fairly dramatic, and then also in the case of London with setting up the GLA. In both instances, these cities relied on networks, on connections, on also knowledge partnerships, which long sort of predated the setting up of the new institutions. So it was much more a continuous adjustment of building networks and coalitions that then were able to really think holistically about the physical and transport development in the two cities. And then finally, as much as we always think our agenda for integration is the incorporation of everything and really bringing all aspects to the table when we make the decision, that's actually impossible. Total integration would overwhelm any governance system. So we come back to a finding that in the end, if we want to sort of join up certain policy sectors, we need to prioritize that link. And both cities radically prioritize the connection between transport and land use and housing over other relationships that maybe before were more important. So that is also quite important. Good. So a few empirical insights, so you have also an understanding what this actually means in practice. Here are the two city regions, of course, quite different regional patterns, and already at that point, important to highlight that the metropolitan regional governance in Berlin and the integration of transport within the metro region and the city and across those works much better because there are formal institutions, whereas in the London case, as many of you will know, we actually, if anything, it's sort of national government at times stepping in, or some random convenings, conferences of the regions, which don't really do much. So at the very regional, metropolitan region level, there is a pronounced difference between the coordination that exists. Now, what you see here is in the entrance area of the Berlin Ministry for Urban Development, which existed in its form and shape up to pretty much 2014. And that was actually, as a ministry, keeping in mind Berlin being a federal state of Germany, very powerful institution, one of the key drivers for bringing the integrative agenda forward. What you see here over time from 91 to 2011 is how in red ministries that were aligned with transport, housing, urban development initially were distributed across 3 different ministries, taken care of sometimes even by different political parties and quite powerful ministers or secretaries. And although they were, of course, already hearing a lot about the sustainable transport narrative, the political infighting in the end didn't really enable the rollout of an integrated agenda up to the point where this department was really becoming one super ministry under one roof, under one leadership, really then enabling a far more effective process. And, you know, we won't have the time to go through the details here, but really across the political spectrum and also across different delivery units, that was really seen as a crucial moment in making things happen and unlocking things. And around that time, 2010, 2011, then as an outcome of a series of reforms, you had almost an exemplary urban development ministry here, which features directly under then the secretary or the minister, three key strands, which, yes, of course, then under that roof had to be subdivided for division of labor purposes, but it was joined up in a clear vision, in a clear leadership, and a leadership that allowed the cross-cutting, project-based collaboration, the teams that could call each other and work on a daily basis with each other rather than against each other. Now, the London case is very familiar for all of you, so and also in some ways with Transport for the North, I guess, buying into some of the narrative around TfL, Transport for London. I think in this instance, if you haven't seen it, this is a very nice visualization by my colleague Tony Travers, trying to really think back how transport was governed in London, and that is the area of Greater London, up to 2000. It was distributed across, of course, vertically different ministries and then departments, appointed bodies. The boroughs were quite strong, and broadly speaking, it was a complete mess. And what was then done through a series of reforms, and in particular since 2000 with TfL, is of course bring some order into that system, and that was indeed a complete game changer. TfL's governance today looks again a bit different. Here in 2013, surface transport, rail and underground planning, and then of course a few additional units which had not sort of that direct connection with planning. What is important, the term planning here relates to transport planning through the mayor who, I'm quoting Ken Livingstone here, I was able to push TfL into every direction. So that gives you a sense of the authority, a mayor being able to chair the board and appoint board members, that this of course enables coherence to some degree. But then also the mayor, of course, separately overseeing the planning unit at the Greater London Authority and providing that connectivity, quite important. What we are seeing in London is the emergence of a networked technocracy. I think that's also important, rather than a more sort of deliberate democracy or public participation shift of transport. It remains a quite technical engagement with consultative moments for sure, and of course elections of the mayor and the GLA, but the integration processes themselves really run through a technocracy. I mentioned already before, there are, of course, major shortcomings. The metropolitan region, here this wonderful drawing by Sir Peter Hall, the late planner, who really communicated quite well. There isn't even agreement what metropolitan London is about, leave aside any clear institutions that help us with regional governance in this instance. And then at the polar opposite scale, up until recently, you still were able to see huge contradictions in the rollout of sort of an urban design paradigm linked to transport. This is 2013, 14, where these streets on the strands were redesigned literally the same year, different boroughs and different units overseeing the development, the bottom already buying into the shared place, the sort of openness, and the top much more the conventional, let's fence it all and protect, I don't know who, the car or the pedestrian. That's always debatable. Now, as a sort of extraction of that work, it's quite important maybe to leave you with a few integration mechanisms which very clearly were activated in the case of London and Berlin, a lot around structures, the top left box here, developing these networks of trust, but also single node leadership in many instances, a range of processes of managing these interrelated tasks, and really fostering a new culture of collaboration. And then two supporting boxes here are instruments around, of course, now even more so, information and communication technology, sharing data, having sort of the virtual fully integrated. Second, the strategic plans and integrated strategies. The London plan has really been an enabler here, but also the transport vision by the mayor himself, and increasingly also new forms of doing integrated assessments. And then last but not least, enabling the capacity of individuals. All these organizations, London more than Berlin, so the change of not just the leadership, but also the supporting technical staff. New people were brought in with very different skill sets, with an openness to understanding sectors they weren't educated in, and that, of course, also made an enormous difference. Both cities established quite a sophisticated way of training people up, lifelong learning, and helping also with the existing workforce that they are up to speed with delivering this integrated agenda. Now, why is all of this so important at the city level? Well, the fundamental argument is that, or metropolitan/city level, there is no other layer of government or sphere of government that's better equipped to really deliver the integrated, coordinated agenda when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to spatial development, and therefore we have to take advantage of the system at this sort of interim scale of development. Higher up at the national or the supranational, the departments are even more specialized, more working in silos, more working with separate budgets, and often lack a real clear comprehension of an integrated region, a system, which they are also, each of the workers and the leaders in the region experience on a daily basis. Once you integrate at the city level or the metro level, yes, you can then, of course, break it down into specific projects, into units of delivery, into infrastructure programs, but there needs to be this one point where you join up the densities, the uses, where the key transport network is going, and so on, and that's clearly the city and metropolitan level. If you're interested in this, I published a book which incorporates some of this in 2018. There's also an online version available. It's all about sort of governing compact cities with this central sub-question around how to connect planning, design, and transport. Let me stop the screen share and thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Philip. That was a really interesting presentation. Some really useful thoughts in terms of policy and governance. I thought it was really striking the pictures of the contrast in various boroughs in terms of one, obviously opting for the more sort of open public realm, and the other with the heavy guardrailings. So that was really interesting. Thank you. There's a few questions in the side bar, which I'll come on to now. And the first is around obviously the published research, which you've just touched upon. So is that Road 2016, or is this a more recent publication which the presentation was based?
Yeah, there are a few publications out there. If you want to have the full overview, it's the book from 2018, but you'll also find some earlier publications which touch upon that.
Perfect. Around the sort of, you touched upon earlier, around sort of land scarcity and sort of the mindset in the UK population. A lot of this sort of issues around land scarcity comes from politics, the media, and community leaders. Is there anything to be said around the sort of media approach abroad on such topics? So could this be researched to understand sort of how other countries adopt a mindset on sort of land scarcity?
So that is a question which I didn't really investigate in detail. I guess in the Berlin case, in the wider metropolitan region, land scarcity isn't really an issue. The state of Brandenburg, which is sort of the surrounding state of Berlin, is the state with by far the lowest population density in Germany. So in theory, if you wanted to plaster large swathes of green areas with housing, you could do so. I think what has been driving the prevention of that is really a sort of sustainable development paradigm and acute awareness of the negative environmental consequences. There was sort of a very sort of brief gold rush period in the early 1990s where some sprawl really started to emerge, and that was then quickly seen as hugely problematic and development by now is a bit more coherent. In London, of course, it's very different, and here, particularly within the city, if you acknowledge the current the sort of current claims on land and also the NIMBYism, you could see there is enormous land scarcity. However, outer London features often in great proximity to very good public transport densities which are unacceptably low, at least for the logic of integrated land use and transport. In these instances, I guess the next decade will see an increasing question, as we heard from the previous speakers, of how some of that housing, often very monofunctional housing, can be upgraded, and along the upgrading can be intensified, urbanized, and ultimately also be made more attractive for the populations living in that area. And you could easily build on top of existing London a city of probably another 5 million people if you were to not everywhere, but in the key areas, apply the urbanism logic of Barcelona, Paris, Rome, or whatever it may be.
Perfect, thank you. How important is devolution or local government reform in the north of England in resolving the transport and local planning issues in northern cities?
Well, I mean, obviously it's hugely important. The question is how is it done? But the first principle of national government letting go is, of course, universally accepted. I think there are then much more difficult questions: how much of the budget, which is still overseen by the Treasury, may have to be devolved, and then there are the questions around how are you going to be locally organized? I mean, in the London case, we of course had tensions between boroughs and then this new sphere, and I'm sure that's the same also in the north, where you have a sense of, all right, power is now being centralized, taken away from the boroughs higher up. And the argument would be that for strategic roads, certainly that's what you want. And if you have followed how unintegrated our rollout of car sharing has been, the answer is yes, because it's done at the borough level, borough by borough, negotiated individually. So these are, of course, major constraints which even London is still facing.
Perfect, thank you. Just follow with two final questions. The first is, have you looked at the contrasts between levels of devolved funding and decision-making comparing cities in the UK and Europe, and how that impacts on integration mechanisms and outcomes?
So not specifically around the funding flow in the spirit of following the money, how that is really done. I guess we're all acutely aware that, and I already hinted at this, with the devolution agenda, the way it's pursued in this country, you're never entirely safe as a region, as a metropolitan institution, from central government taking a new view, taking a different view on funding, and depriving you on what is needed. Many European or continental countries have, of course, institutionally protected self-governance of their cities and regions, so that kind of power grab would be impossible. And therefore the tax base, the local tax base, and the revenues available for more devolved and independent decisions, and maybe also decisions unpopular within the federal government, that's much more possible in those contexts compared to the UK.
Perfect, brilliant. And sort of the final question, I've had another one as well, is back to are there any lessons from London and Berlin and the systems integration that has been achieved that can be applied, and have these been applied successfully in rural areas? And just to follow up on that, Berlin has successfully reintroduced trams from the east. London has DLR and Croydon, who have not been successful in a similar spread. Why not? So just around the sort of between the two examples.
Let's start with the last one. The Tram Expansion in the Berlin case was really coming from East Berlin and bringing at the core of the city the tram back where it used to be before. And that already gives you the main difference, which is you're investing into tram system at the heart of activity, rather in more sort of peripheral context where it's also more run like a surface, maybe rail system. So that is really important to appreciate, making the tram successful as a really urban and very sort of city center focused means of transport. You may remember that Ken Livingstone wanted to build a tram from Camden, no, where was it? Yes, it was Camden to Brixton, and that there was even sort of advanced design studies. It was never fully funded, but I can assure you, a tram system like that would be equally successful than what we have seen in Berlin. Remind me, what was the other component?
Any lessons learned from London and Berlin that can be applied successfully in rural areas? So moving that sort of urban examples to more rural areas.
Yeah, I think that that is much more difficult. But what I would say is, I mean, the German planning system has one major problem. It provides a massive financial incentive for rural communities and towns to expand as much as possible, to build as much as possible greenfield, because they can keep the taxes they get from then basically newcomers. And that is something to be avoided, to provide any incentives for then uncoordinated overdevelopment often, where some of these developments aren't used, is hugely problematic. In turn, it leads then to the question how, if you keep a more remote location, you don't further develop it, how can you ensure that there is still a vibrant community and futures possible? And I think we are now seeing a very clear answer to this around virtualization and bringing in cables rather than roads.
Brilliant. Thank you, Philip. Thank you for all those submitting questions. That was a really useful presentation, so thank you for presenting once again. So it's time to wrap up now today's Known Evidence Academic Forum. I'd like to thank Philip, Guilherme, Anthony and Tim for all presenting today, and to all the attendees who've attended, thank you very much. The next presentation, the next forum will be on the 18th of May, so please look out for the further details to follow on that. And once again, I'd like to thank you, and all contents from the presentation will be available on TFN's website. Thank you all.